Thank you, Amy, for the presentation, and also thank MCI for the opportunity to share my research. So the title of my talk today is Agrarian Capitalism and Uneven Development in Rural China. And so yeah, Amy already gave the introduction, so let me dive right in. Okay, so the empirical focus of my dissertation, so this comes from my PhD, my dissertation research, is on the rise of agrarian capitalism in China. So first, some context for people who are not very familiar with this particular topic. So since since China started the reform, in the early China's reform really began in the countryside. So in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, the Chinese state made this reform. It's called household responsibility system. So pretty much it dissolved the rural collectives and redistributed land use right, farmland use right, to individual peasant households. Afterwards, for almost 3 decades, land holding among Chinese peasantry has been very egalitarian. And also for that period, there really weren't formal laws that allow peasants to trade their farmland. But this really began to change in the late 2000s through what the Chinese government called land transfer. So land transfer is actually a euphemism for land rental. And this reform has 2 key components. So step 1, it commodifies farmland into a rental property. So land use right now becomes rentable. And this is in direct service to step 2, which is to concentrate farmland from peasant households to large-scale commercial farming. So this is what the Chinese state call the third great land reform. The first one came with the Chinese Communist Revolution, and the second one was the dissolve of rural collectives, and this is the third one. So in the span of 10 years, the national land transfer or land rental rate jumped from around 10% in 2009 to almost 40% in 2019. So that is a picture illustration of the process. Okay, so my dissertation, my research has it focuses on 3 key research questions. The first one is what are the macro historical driving forces of this policy? And second, what are the diverse local trajectories and developmental outcomes? And third, what are the impacts on peasant livelihood and spatial inequality? Okay, so a little bit about methods and field size. So I did 19 months of comparative ethnography in 2 rural counties. The first one is in the coastal area. It's called Zhejiang province. And then the second one is in northern Anhui province. It's inland, very agricultural, very rural. So combined, I did more than 200 interviews with peasant households, agribusinesses, and also state officials. In addition, I also conducted archival research. Okay, so first, a very brief recap of the main findings. So the first major argument that I make in the book and also in the book manuscript is this nationwide push for land transfer after 2008. First of all, it's an internal spatial fix. So this is a David Harvey term. Is one of the solutions the Chinese state came up after the 2008 global financial crisis. To find new outlets or new spaces for overaccumulated urban capital. To have somewhere for them to invest. And then the second major argument again I make is the expansion of land transfer it takes place through a very classical experiment evolution process. So there are 2 distinct local pathways. The first pathway is in the coastal early industrialized regions. So this is the experimental stage. So in this stage, land transfer was mostly bottom-up process, and this has led to relatively more commercial success. And later on, after 2008, circa 2010, the reform was elevated to a national level model, and it was implemented in the inland region, in the vast rural inland regions. But in these regions, the expansion of land transfer was really a top-down process, enforced by state, with punishments for cadres for failing to meet the quota. But eventually, so far, this reform in the inland regions has led to many business failures, and in turn worsened the livelihood crisis for rural households in the inland regions. And at the end, so far what we can tell is, based on the findings, is this internal spatial fix hasn't been particularly successful in really, addressing the crisis of accumulation or reducing spatial inequality. Okay, so to talk about the theoretical intervention very briefly, or like the framework. First, overall, this I used like the Harveyan and Marxist framework of crisis of overaccumulation and like spatial fix, right, as I kind of mentioned. And then the second body of literature that I engage with is like this growing like scholarship on the political economy of development. So in the Chinese context, there has been like this very like it becomes like a mainstream story that try to explain the past success of Chinese development. That like one of the reasons, or like one of the institutional reason, is how the Chinese state has been really flexible in doing this kind of local experiments. Try different things in different places, and then to see which works, and then to elevate that into a national model. So that pretty much explains the early stages of development. What my research contributes is really focusing on the second stage. So after we have this localized success, right? So the flip side of local success is growing inequality across regions. And then the next step the Chinese state tries to do is to narrow those inequality across spaces. And they try to use the same institutional model, and through coming from experiment. So I'm really examining how this emulation process takes place, and and also like its impacts and outcomes. And the third major genre of literature concerns this relation between commodification, accumulation, and dispossession. So in the global south context, especially in agrarian study, many people tend to equate the process of commodification with dispossession, right? But actually, my research finds that the relation is actually more complicated and uncertain. And one key intermediating mechanism is accumulation, right? So what I find is in the coastal cases, if commodification can actually lead to successful accumulation, then this does not necessarily translate into dispossession, right? But in the inland case, it's kind of commodification leads to failure of accumulation and then leads to dispossession. And the last body of literature is on this classical debates on the relative strength and between capitalist farming and peasant farming, and also the future of China's peasant population. Okay, so first, the major the macro historical origins. So before 2008, China's mode of growth has really been this urban-centered, export-oriented mode of growth, and under this broad structure, the countryside was assigned a position as the provider of cheap food and labor, right? All the migrant laborers coming from the countryside to the cities. But this mode of growth really came under crisis in 2008, with plummeting global orders, and also in the early 2000s, the continuous rural poverty really evolved into a serious crisis for the Chinese state. So for the Chinese audiences, we all heard about the term called 三农危机, right? So this term really began to emerge in the early 2000s and late 1990s. So it is under this context, right? So the Chinese state decided, okay, now we should try to open up the countryside for capital to come in, and for the Chinese state, the entrance of capital is also an opportunity for growth for the Chinese countryside, for agriculture. And potential for growth means for the policymakers potential development. And with this type of development, then there is a possibility that they can solve the crisis, they can fix it spatially, and also reduce unequal spatial unevenness. Okay, so the first trajectory, but before going into the emulation stage, the first trajectory is the experimental stage. So this is what I find in the coastal early industrialized regions. So here, the development of land transfer was mostly a bottom-up, spontaneous process without extensive state intervention. And this was primarily driven by local industrialization. So as you can see in Figure 2 on the right, so the blue line is the percentage of total labor force in agriculture. You can see it declined steadily and significantly over 2 decades. And these two are for manufacturing and service sectors. So this was the primary reason, because many people have left villages to work in factories, so they want someone to take over their land. So this dynamic is really encapsulated in this quote from one of the farmers, one of the people I interviewed. So So he said, at the beginning we started with only 20 mu of our household's own farmland. We rarely encounter situations where peasants were unwilling to rent their land to us. Actually, many peasants came to them to ask, can we rent our land to you? And then And at the time, like the land deals were often within village, and they were like very like informal, and they just signed those kind of like they didn't even sign contracts. It's like verbal agreements renewed every year. So in this region, as you can see, it's like gradual expansion. So by the time like the Chinese state decided to implement land transfer nationwide, you can see around late 2000s, the local land transfer rate was already very high. So here in County Z, in the Zhejiang case, it's already more than 40%, meaning that many peasant households have already transferred their land among themselves. And through all these years, with the gradual bottom-up development, the local state in that county in Zhejiang also formed like a very institutionalized relation or cooperation with agribusinesses or commercial farms. And two of the key institutional mechanisms are, first, like the county government has this affiliated agricultural research institute, which is mostly responsible for disseminating technologies or policy information. And then the second mechanism is called like farmers association. So farmers use that as a collective platform to get back to the government about their own needs, to talk about like which areas can be further improved to help us further develop our business. So this is another quote from the vice president of the farmers cooperative. So he says, we big householders like voluntarily set up the cooperative. Like government has been very supportive. It plays vital functions in transmitting policies to farmers. And cadres will publish new policies in our like WeChat group. They dare not withhold information about subsidies. So like information has been like very transparent in the Zhejiang case. So everyone knows knows about the policy as soon as like they came out pretty much. And yeah, so like they dare not withhold information from farmers, and information is transparent. Local governments have this part maybe just kissing their ass, but like overall it's still like local government relatively performed like relatively well over the years, like meeting the needs of agribusinesses. Okay, then move to the post late 2000, to the early 2000s, to the second trajectory in the inland regions. And after the Chinese state decided, okay, so this is working well, we're gonna do this nationally. So in this inland region, in County A, what I find is, so before the land transfer kicked in, subsistence farming still dominated at the time. So in the local economic structure, like peasant households primarily rely on one hand household farming, on the other hand migrant labor. So there really wasn't bottom-up land transfer before the state's promotion, since early 2010s. So here is the quote from one of the peasant household. So this person said, like 95% of the people who were living in the village, like old villagers, because younger people have already been out. They were saying like they were against land transfer when it first happened. These were old people, nobody wanted it for any other work. So farming is pretty much like their only source of income. Yeah, and like they worry about like not receiving land rent, and like working on our own land was like safer, right? If we lost it, then what are we gonna eat? They're like very practical concerns. Right. So here, so like this relatively late development of land transfer can be seen here in figure 4. Right? You can see like around 2010, the local land transfer rate was extremely low, like fewer than 5%. But like after this become a national policy, really, like land transfer was, for a long time, like a political mission or like central task for local officials in County A, in this Anhui province side. So what they do is, they assign yearly quotas to the township level, to the village level, basically saying you need to transfer 10% of all our farmland in a particular year. Otherwise, local cadres will face punishments, salary deduction, or like loss of chance for promotion, etc. So really like forcing them to put pressure on peasants to transfer their land to businesses. And this is the direct quote from the so in 2012, County A's government organized this meeting. It says the county had the county party secretary required to immediately start a vigorous land transfer campaign to push forward large-scale commercial agricultural production. And right after this, you can see how the land transfer rate kind of jumped really fast in 10 years from maybe 3% to 35%. Under this trajectory, lots of the farms, lots of new agribusinesses were formed through this kind of one-time large land deals. Yes, but like after this wave or several years of intensive land transfer campaign, like problem began to emerge. So like the state was very interested in concentrating the land for agribusinesses, but local officials weren't that attentive to the ensuing development of those agribusinesses. So as long as you get the land, we finish the evaluation, then that's it. So here, we really didn't see kind of sustained mechanism for state capital interaction that emerged. They didn't emerge after the intensive land transfer campaign. The dominant mentality among the officials after land transfer was we don't want to take any more responsibility, right? So just don't bother us. You can do whatever you want, just don't ask us for more favors. So this is the quote from one of the local officials. She said, local government's attitudes towards big households is really problematic here. We brought them in, but paid no attention to their condition, and simply let them to let them swim or die. At the township level, everything is for evaluation, and no one really cares about local development. And now there's no evaluation, so all the more reasons to sit idly, to do nothing. Yes. So through these two trajectories, of land transfer, we really have two opposite trajectories of farm development. In the coastal regions, we see it's really gradual, slow expansion, taking in land gradually. But in the inland region, it's really this overnight, large scale, land deal. So, as a result, so in the coastal region, early development, many of the farms have been in operation for many more years, but in the inland regions, many of them only came into existence in the past decade through those one-time instant land deals. And this have some implications, in multiple aspects. So first, more time to run your farm and expand gradually naturally gives you more time and opportunities to accumulate the know-how, how to manage farms, make mistakes and learn from the experiences, right? But this wasn't really given to the inland farmers because they took in a large chunk of land and went into immediate production, right? And this is also the same for, in terms of financial burden. Taking in land gradually really allows you to don't overextend yourself, right? You only take in land that you can manage. But in the inland regions, because many of the agribusiness, business owners, they were lured by promises of government subsidies. So they took in huge sum of land and then make huge investments, but many of them actually are taking debt to finance those kind of endeavors. And this kind of, so this means that from the very beginning, the agribusinesses in the inland regions, they face big, very intense pressure. They need to go into production immediately, and also they need to, to build their market access and also to generate income because they need to recover some of the costs, right? Some of the money they have invested. But this pressure is much less severe for farmers in the coastal regions because they have much more time to develop and also to, to make decisions according to their own capability. And as a result, many of the farmers in the inland regions, right after they stepped into agriculture, maybe 2 or 3 years later, they became heavily indebted. Okay, and now, the next part will be on, so now I've talked about pretty much on the dynamics on the production side, and now I'm moving to the market side. Now you concentrate the lands, you create the farms, but still, ultimately, if you want to generate profits, then if you want realization of the value using Marxist terms, then you need to sell your products. Right? That's the only way for them to make profit. So I'm gonna examine different layers, or this is an overview of the agricultural product market in China. So pretty much I divide it into 3 layers. At the bottom layer is the everyday, the fresh market that you go to, farmers market, really, at the county center, so everyday rural market. And then the middle layer is regional, wholesale, supermarkets at regional cities, right? It's bigger than counties, but still not as big as cities like Beijing and Shanghai. And the top layer is high-end retail, so this is really nationwide, especially with online sales, so you can ship your products to whoever, to consumers throughout the entire country. Right. So the bottom 2 layers of markets really have lots of similarities. So in these 2 layers, it's really primarily about like having a competitive advantage in low price. And so like if your product is too expensive, then consumers can shift to a different one like really easily. And at the top layer, it's really like this is where like most of the profits come from. So this is where like the profit margin is high, and consumers really want high quality, or even like they treat agricultural products as like status goods, like using Bourdieu's term, right? Because they want this to have some cultural meaning. When they use them as gifts, they want this to be like good gifts, like not like sad, so they want them to have some kind of like cultural embodiment. Okay, yeah. So to talk about market, first I compared the peasant households, because this is where the agribusinesses compete directly with the peasant households. So in terms of production cost, so for peasant households who work on their own land, first they don't need to pay land rent, and second they use their own family labor, but like this, these are all costs for the agribusinesses. And like in terms of seed and fertilizer, like the per mu cost is like pretty much the same. And like in terms of like bagging, like other costs are pretty much the same. But the big differences really come from land rent and labor. Because peasant households don't need to pay those two costs, so their average production cost is much lower than that for the commercial farmers, for the agribusinesses. So this really gives peasant households like advantages. They have like strong price elasticity. They can sell at really low price, or they can sell at really high price. Even at very low prices, they can still make a profit. So this quote is from one of the peasant households. So this person was saying like every sale is making a profit. So long as we can sell them, right? Then that's money, that's like net income for us. But that is not the case for the commercial farmers. Yeah, so because of the institutional setup, how farmers access their land in China, they need to pay land rent, right? They need to hire the labor. Right, so farmers were really, in these two layers of market, they were really at this structural disadvantage. They have higher production costs due to the institutional setup, so they don't really quite compete with peasants in a price war. Yeah, so like in the inland counties, this is one of their biggest difficulties is they don't have any local market. They don't have any like local population that can afford their products. So this quote says, in the county market, like no one will buy if your price is higher than like 3 yuan, which is like 30 cents or something. And local supermarkets demands are also like very limited, only like small amounts. And they want the cheap products, not the expensive products. So I only leave the worst fruits for the local market, and the local supermarkets also understand like why they do this. And in the coastal region, the agribusinesses, many of them just simply refuse to engage or to participate in those two lower layers of market because they're just not profitable. And because many of them, brand their own products as like status goods, so they want like to maintain a high price level. If they're saying, if we drop the price, then the price will never recover again, because people will say, this is of poor quality, this is of poor status, right? So no one will want them as presents anymore. So they intentionally keep their price high and don't engage in the two lower markets. But in the higher end, the national retail market, so this is where most of the profits come from. But like here, like farmers in the coastal region, they really they have like lots of advantages. So like many years of like gradual expansion of the consumer base, closer to consumers, because most of the wealthy population in China are in coastal regions, right? And also like they enjoy government support in different areas. So they have been like, many of them have been like able to make profits in those, to establish their own niche market, to reap the profits. But this is not the case for farmers in the inland regions. They don't really have market access. They don't have government support either. So like farmers in the inland regions don't really have stable access to any of the layers of the agricultural product market nationwide. Right? So they're like, many of them are really struggling at the time that I did research. But in the case for the farmers in the coastal regions, they don't participate in the two lower layers, but they can make stable income from the top layer. So their situation is much better. And As a consequence, like many of the farms in the inland regions have been like heavily indebted and like losing money. Many of them even have already just exited agriculture altogether. And but in comparison, farmers in the coastal regions, in my sample, like many of them are much more successful. So in the inland regions, like agricultural, like agrarian accumulation, many of them failed, and farmers become indebted. And as a result, the farmers can't afford to pay land rent to peasants anymore. And this transmits into peasants losing their land-based income, and then translates into de facto dispossession. Even though the original policy design of the Chinese state was, its rental is not permanent change in ownership. One of the original intention is to keep peasants' claim to land-based income, but this still happens at the end. Okay, so in the inland regions, what happened after, peasants failed to receive land rent, after they were plunged into this income crisis? Because if you are not receiving income, then many of you will become, many of us will become grievance, right? We want to launch protests against the farmers, against local states, right? But my research finds that in those inland regions where agrarian capitalist accumulation failed, peasants did try to organize protests, but many of those protests haven't been particularly successful in the past years. And this kind of rent protest is really it's really hard to assess how many there are throughout China, because these kind of things really don't really go into news coverage that often. And also there is another reason which I'm going to delve into in a second. So overall, it's very difficult to quantify and then to assess the overall seriousness of this. So one of the reasons why this is difficult to quantify is that peasants themselves were reluctant to report this to the local state. And why? It's because many of the agribusinesses or entrepreneurs, they weren't simply just outsiders or strangers that have no prior interaction with peasants before. Actually, many of the agribusiness owners, they were from the same village where they rented land, because they want to go back to their own hometown to run the land. They know the people, they have the social connection, which makes land transfer much easier, right? So when they went to their own, went back to their home village to run the land, they're actually returning home entrepreneurs. So in this sense, capital really is socially embedded. It's not something external to the village communities. And this makes it all the more difficult for peasants to actually, to voice their complaints to outsiders, to strangers. And so this quote from one of the villagers that I interviewed, he says, those who were relatives with the farmers, and those so because this kind of social embeddedness, peasants really can't, they're reluctant to voice their complaints. And on the other hand, local elites, when the entrepreneurs, when they came back, the local village elites, they often helped, the returning home entrepreneurs to persuade other peasant households, to transfer their lands and then to consolidate. But because of this kind of social embeddedness, so even though the local elites lobbied for land transfer, but when land protests, rent protests emerged, they refused to participate because they want to maintain their relation with the entrepreneurs, who were another part of the local elites. So this means that the refusal of local elites to participate or to organize peasant rent protests really paralyzed those kind of events or those kind of actions. And ordinary peasants, without the help of local elites, local peasants weren't really able to mobilize through this kind of vertical social, local, village social networks. So, the previous, many studies before have found, when peasants protest against state actors is usually local, village heads or teachers or ex-soldiers who acted as peasants' leaders. But this is not the case here, because many of those local elites were connected to the entrepreneurs. Yeah. So yes, this is a quote from one of the villagers as to why they failed to mobilize. So those who were relatives with the farmer and those who lobbied on their behalf, they all took money from the farmer privately. So they had ability, but they didn't lead. So people who were impacted, people who were impacted the most were the small ones, like the ordinary villagers who don't really have local power. So these are the people who can't make money. Like they didn't have the ability to pressure the farmers. So this is why this kind of like vertical mobilization among village residents failed to materialize. And why? So if that fails, then can peasants try organize among themselves, right? So that also fails so far, and that has to do also with it also has to do with the embeddedness of agrarian capital, because these are not strangers. This can be like your nephew, or this can be like the son-in-law of my cousin or something, right? So this makes it really difficult for peasants to organize protest. And there is this this concept of phase, right? So peasants were thinking, if we really make this, really make a sin out of this, expose this to others, to outsiders, then they're worried that we may lose face as a village, as a collective. We may lose face in the face or in the eyes of others. So they kind of they were reluctant. So this person was saying, we're all from the same village. No one wants to lead because we're too embarrassed. This. Well, one of the farmers' extended household has at least several dozen people. You still have to socialize. You still have to socialize with them. So you can't cut off social relations completely simply because of the issue of land rent. So this way, land rent becomes socially embedded. It's not only economic or only contractual. Right? So this makes it very difficult to organize. And many of the peasants have been going to farmers to protest individually, but this hasn't been very successful because it's one peasant. It's very easy for farmers to deal with. Okay, so let me wrap up by discussing the distributional impacts of this kind of dynamics, right? So especially in the inland regions. So I approach this question of the distributional impacts of land transfer by looking at the broad livelihood structure of peasant households in China. So especially for the elderly people who still live in China. So for many of them, they have several major sources of income. So first, filial support. Second, farming income from land. Third, pension. And last, other sources of non-farming income. So let me talk about non-farming income first. So this again is where the spatial inequality kicks in. So in the coastal region, so here as you can see in table 4, so in the inland county in Anhui, so local rural households, peasant households, they don't really have income from local collective economy. They don't have income from different sources of house rental or spare work. And also their income from pension is very minimum. But all these sources of income are much more substantial for rural households in the coastal region in Zhejiang. And why is this? So there's some further very results from the household surveys. And why is this? Is because of this structural inequality, spatially, in China. So in the coastal regions, there are local factories and local industrializations, right? So those kind of development create all sorts of income opportunities for the local rural households. So they can rent their houses to migrant workers who come from the inland, so local rural households in Zhejiang. They can rent their houses to migrant workers, and also many of those villages in Zhejiang, they also many of those villages, they also run their own factories, or they lease their land to factory owners. So there is another source of collective economy, and this translates into dividends for villagers at the end of the year. And also with more factories and more all-farm employment opportunities, many of the villagers in the coastal region, they can also find different kind of spare works, like janitor, or even gate, gate guard, or work in factories sporadically, even though those incomes are not a lot, but still important for rural households. And all of those income, none of those sources is available for the inland rural households, because that place, as I said, is still mostly agricultural until today. So really isn't much other sources of income. Okay, yeah. And then I want to talk about filial support, which is another source of income for elderly villagers, really briefly. So filial support really, is about how rural households allocate the resources among different generations, among different household members. And this allocation takes place among different household reproductive activities. So according to feminist and Marxist scholarship, social reproduction of households has several main components. The first one, child rearing, socialization, and this institutionally speaks to education, sending your children to school. And another part of social reproduction is the provision of livelihood and care, which is the main question here. And then the third major component is biological procreation. And in China, in rural China today, biological procreation still mostly takes place through or after marriage. And what I find is now the key components of social reproduction in rural China, even though very remote regions, have been extensively commodified in the past decade. So in terms of education, so before, many Chinese villages, they have their own primary schools, and townships, they have their own middle schools. But many of those schools have been closed in the past decade. And in correspondence, the county government has been setting and creating public schools in the county seat. But those public schools in the county seat, their tuition is really low, but that comes, access to county seat public school is actually commodified because it depends on home ownership in the school districts. So school district is very famous in China. So you need, and also I think that is the case in the US as well. So if you want to go to school, go to a particular school, you need to have home ownership in the designated school districts of that particular school, right? We may think of this as an urban phenomenon, but I'm actually finding this is the case in one of the most remote regions in rural China. So rural parents today, they also need to buy to buy an apartment in the county seat to send their children to nominally free and cheap, very affordable public schools. So this number shows, over the years, the percentage of students in County A, in Anhui, who go to public schools in the county. You can see how that increased. And behind this is growing home ownership, and many rural households purchase apartments in the county seat. And this again then translates into household debt, because even though by our standards the housing price there is cheap, but that is a lot for rural households. Yeah. So this quote. This person said, it is so difficult to get your children into schools now. It's either, county private school, which are much more expensive tuition-wise, or county public school. So there is no other option. Previously, there were junior highs nearby, in the township, but they were all closed over the years. Yeah, and the same story of commodification also happens to marriage. So marriage, and again, a county seat apartment has become a precondition for marriage in rural China over the years. So in the inland regions, the reason is very straightforward. It's imbalanced sex ratio due to the one-child policy. So this is the local sex ratio, the blue dotted line. As you can see, how crazy it has become over the years. For the cohort, for the population that were born between 2006 and 2010, the male to female sex ratio was 1.26. So 5 men for 4 women. Right? So this really increased the pressure in the local marriage market. And again, this translates into higher entrance barriers. Right? So if you want to be competitive, you need to invest more. And this is in the form of buying apartments. And even in the coastal region, where you can see actually the sex ratio isn't that absurd, is relatively normal, and there is still this conception or this connection between home ownership, this conception of home ownership's gender identity. So even in the coastal region, it is considered culturally that it is the groom side, who need to take the responsibility of providing a house for the bride. And this also has to do with power relations within marriage afterwards. So if the groom side fails to buy an apartment, then the bride side's family may look down upon him in the future and after marriage. So even this means heavy financial pressure. Many of those households, especially those with sons, still try their best to buy an apartment for their son's marriage. So this quote is summarizes the dynamic really well. So if a groom doesn't buy a home, people will automatically think he chooses like metro local residence. So he will have no social standing, and his father-in-law will look down upon him. And his children will take the bride's family name, which is a big deal in China even today. So the groom must buy a home, even if he has to borrow from every single relative. So with this dynamics, we really see this real estateization of reproductive activities in China over the past decade. So every social reproductive activities has to do with housing right now, has to do with home ownership. Yeah. So you can see the jump in like how many rural households are rushing to the countryside, to the county seat to buy apartments in the past 20 years. It's like very dramatic change. And many of them are very explicitly for reproductive purposes. Yeah. Okay, so this really, the consequence of home ownership is a dramatic increase in household burden, like financial burden. So many of them, because they need to buy a house, they become heavily indebted as a consequence. And so you can see like all the financial resources and also labor resources are concentrated towards the youngest generation, right? And it's for people who are in marriage age and also for children. And no resource is left for older villagers, older family members. And this means really like a collapse of filial support in rural China over the years. Like no one, I talk even though my sample size is relatively small, around 100 peasant households, very few of them still, the older family members still receive routine support from their younger household members anymore. So this really has collapsed in the past decade. Yeah. Okay. So to wrap up, here, we really have, it's in rural Zhejiang, we have witnessed this gradual de-agrarianization of elderly villagers' livelihood. So even though land is still important, but they have other sources of all-farm income, and even for and also because agrarian capitalism has been more successful in Zhejiang. So ironically, villagers in Zhejiang who actually need the farming income less, their farming income is actually more secured because of more successful agrarian capital accumulation. And it is the reverse in rural Anhui. In Anhui, with no few alternative sources of income, land actually matters much more to older villagers in the countryside, older villagers. But actually here, agrarian capital accumulation is more is more likely to fail, with all the dynamics that I have described, right? So the impacts of land transfer on, livelihood of older villagers really, diverge across the two sides. So in the inland region, so this person says, old people's survival, of course, depends on land. If we can't get land rent, we can only rely on our children. We will only get money if they're filial, which is in no way guaranteed in today's world. Otherwise, even eating may become a problem. Yeah. So in Zhejiang, so even with all these things, rural households still have sufficient sources of income. But in rural Anhui, failed land transfer is really kind of depriving, right, combined with other dynamics, really depriving older villagers of every major source of their income. So many of them become strapped and become really poor, but they don't really have voices, right, to say this to the wider public. Yes. So as a result, does this policy really kind of narrows the transregional inequality across spaces? Not necessarily. Even though Mai is only a 2 case study, based on several hundred households, a few hundred households, but still, the kind of putting out the potential mechanisms that kind of explains why, originally intended as a spatial fix to narrow inequality across spaces, why that doesn't work. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll stop here. I have a few more slides, but we don't have time. We don't have time anymore. So yeah, I'll just leave the rest of the time for Q&A.